On paper, they're at peace, but in reality, it's much closer to war. The tit-for-tat conflict between Chad and Sudan is taking new turns in spite of a newly inked peace deal. What's at the root of it all? And could this be a new flashpoint on the volatile African continent? Chad, Sudan, and accusations aplenty. This is Inside Story. Hello there, I'm Kamal Santamaria. You know, brothers will nearly always fight, but it's when they apparently start bringing others into their dispute and threatening the stability around them that it becomes much more worrying. And that's kind of how you could describe things between Sudan and Chad right now. African brothers who signed a peace deal in Doha earlier this month, vowing not to fight, but carried on accusing the other of threatening the peace. And in this particular case, one brother, Chad, even admitted to launching attacks, which was met with a vow to destroy Chadian forces who dared enter Sudan. Have a look at the map just to familiarise yourself with the region. Sudan and Chad, they border each other, but it is where the border is which adds another dimension. It is that volatile Darfur region right in the middle. That borders Chad. And already hundreds of thousands of Darfur refugees have crossed into Chad, trying to escape the internal conflict in that part of Sudan. Now, that is the long-standing problem. This current conflict between Sudan and Chad only makes it worse. We'll discuss all that in a moment. First, this report from Beth Ann Howe.
May 2009, Chad and Sudan sign a ceasefire agreement in Qatar. It was supposed to bring an end to, or at least a break in, fighting between the two nations. Within hours of the deal, Chad was accusing Sudan of backing anti-government rebels, and within days carried out a series of cross-border air raids into Sudan.
The ink on the Doha Accord is not dry, and the government of Chad is denouncing the aggressive attitude of the Khartoum regime that has sent several armed battalions with 350 vehicles against our country.
The latest violence is not a new development. The two nations have been uncomfortable neighbours for decades, but tensions have escalated in the last 4 years. Since the end of 2005, Chad has been in a state of civil war, with rebel groups trying to oust the president Idris Deby Itno. Chad has repeatedly claimed the Sudanese government supports and helps to arm these groups. Chad is also intrinsically linked with the Darfur conflict. Hundreds of thousands of refugees from the region claim asylum in eastern Chad. This settlement has seen Sudanese government troops attack camps within Chad's borders, often looking for fighters from Darfur's Justice and Equality movement. In turn, Chadian forces have been targeting fighters over the border in Sudan. The international community has a presence in both Chad and Sudan, and France, which has always had close ties with Chad, is planning to send extra troops of its own to help protect the government. Various accords have been negotiated, but none have had any long-term success. While blame is thrown back and forth between governments, the fighting continues. And caught in the crossfire are civilians. Hundreds killed, millions displaced. Beth Ann Howe, Inside Story.
All right, let's bring in our guests at this point. In Nairobi is Fuad Hikmat. He is the project director for the Horn of Africa at the International Crisis Group. In Paris is Roland Marchal, a senior fellow at the National Centre for Scientific Research. And rounding out our panel in London, Abdul Wahab Al-Afendi. He is a senior research fellow at the Centre for the Study of Democracy. That is at the University of Westminster, I should say. Gentlemen, thank you for your time. Thank you for joining us on Inside Story. Fuad Hikmat in Nairobi, I'd like to come to you first and look at what is happening right now, this current conflict that's been going on since the peace deal was signed. All these accusations and all these threats, is there basis for it all? Chad has admitted to one of these acts, but is there basis for the rest of it all?
Yeah, I think there is a basis for all these. And first of all, the security and the political crisis in Chad is internally rooted. And there is a history in that. And all the agreements have been signed between the government and the unarmed opposition and with the rebel groups in Dakar and Libya, all did not constitute a good framework for finding a final settlement in Chad. And this, of course, they continued the grievances in Chad, and there is a rebel insurgency in Chad. And the situation was aggravated or exacerbated by the spillover of the conflict from Darfur on Chad, and where Chad in 2003 had to take a sort of sides and supported the Darfur rebel insurgency in Darfur. And as a result to that, also the Sudanese government thought that it is time to do a regime change in N'Djamena, as historically always Sudan played that role in changing in N'Djamena and supported the rebel insurgency in Chad, capitalizing on the grievances on east of Chad. And of course, this is a root causes between the two countries that needs to be addressed.
So what you've highlighted there for us quite well is the history. This goes back a long way. The recent history, as I mentioned, was this peace deal that was signed here in Doha. And I want to read something to you. This is from the Qatari Minister of State for Foreign Affairs. He said the agreement stipulates the halting of hostilities. Everyone is now looking to the future, especially as both countries and people have big interests in reconciliation. Roland Marshall in Paris. Is the Doha deal actually worth anything, given they make all these promises and then only a few hours later we're talking about that they're accusing each other already? I know there's a lot of history, but you sign a peace deal and then start accusing each other?
Well, we could say as well that, first, JEM, one of the Darfur insurgent movement, did attack Sudan last week and took over the town of Kornoi. And of course, there are strong allegations that, his sanctuaries are based in Chad. So therefore, the problem is not on one side of the border, it's on both sides of the border. But what I believe is, to a certain extent, the Doha agreement, push certainly the Sudanese regime to, I would say, convince the Chadian rebels to go and stay in Chad. And though they will still get their logistical support from Darfur, from Sudan. So to a certain extent, we have now a kind of clarification of the situation, at least on one side, which means that the Chadian rebels are mostly in Chad. And what has to be seen is whether the Darfur insurgents will as well give up their base in Chad and then go back to Darfur. I do not believe that this war or wars between the two capitals will actually, go anywhere. Right. What needs to be understood maybe more deeply is the linkages between the two political crises in Darfur and in Chad, and a decent way to solve it without pushing either N'Djamena or Khartoum to lose its face, and of course without as well forgetting the grievances of the local population, both in Chad and Darfur, against their own government.
And I guess the point you made there, you made it over and over again, and it's a very good one. You kept talking about the rebels. The rebels were attacking, and I guess it comes down to the fact that these two governments might have signed a deal, but the rebels didn't sign the deal, and I guess they were never really going to. You've got two wars, effectively.
Yeah, what is important is to understand that the war, what we are witnessing is not only a war between two governments, is a kind of both a regional war and a transnational war. And if we don't take into account those different levels, then we won't reach a functioning agreement, because even, for instance, President Deby early in the Darfur conflict was actually very reluctant to support the Darfur insurgency for a number of reasons, including his own alliances with Khartoum. But then eventually he had to do so for the sake of his own political survival in Chad. So we have to take into account those different parameters. And of course, when you have, as happened in Doha, an agreement only between the two states, without at the same time political processes between the armed movements and their respective governments, it is doomed to fail, and is what we have been witnessing the whole months of May, without discussing previous agreements and previous failures over the last 3 years.
Abdul Wahab Al-Effendi in London, let me come to you now. Let's go back, as we've heard some of the recent history there, let's go back to the root of this problem. There are descriptions of these two countries, Sudan and Chad, as siblings, brothers, sisters, whatever you want to call them. I think I referred to them as brothers earlier, but it's like a big brother picking on the little brother, Chad. Is that a fair way of looking at that? Is it the root of the problem?
No, I think the root of the problem is that, as was mentioned earlier, that the Darfur and Chad are actually, there's no real borders between them. They have historically been very close together, and there is a linkage and interconnection between the conflicts in both regions. A lot of groups which are described as the Janjaweed, who were part of the conflict in Darfur, have been originally Chadian refugees from Chad, and a lot also of the rebel movements have also brothers and tribal extension within Chad. So these conflicts, the start of the conflict has been an extension of old rivalries between groups which are living across the border, and I think that both governments do not have control over the rebel movements.
Okay, so if those governments don't have control, sorry to interrupt you, if those governments don't have control, then who needs to step in? The Qataris tried to step in, they were helped by the Libyans, didn't really work it seems. Can't imagine the AU making a huge difference in this particular conflict. Who could step in and make a difference at this point?
I think at the moment the French are very crucial, because the French are the ones who are helping the Chad government against the rebels in Chad, and I think without putting pressure on the government of Chad, we have at the moment a flawed peace process for Darfur, which is being overseen by Doha. On the other side, we don't have a peace process in Chad. And I think one of the ironies of problems like this is, even if the government of Sudan, for example, as Roland Marshall has said, the fighting is between rebels and the governments on both sides. There is no fighting between the government of Sudan and the government of Chad. If the government of Sudan accepts and throws out the rebels, this is precisely what it did with Idris Deby himself. In 1990, the government of Sudan, Idris Deby, was thrown out of Sudan practically, but when he was thrown out, he went and took power in N'Djamena. So just throwing out the rebels without having an agreement, I think this is also probably what the Sudanese government has done. Okay. After signing the Doha agreement with Chad, they probably asked the rebels to go out of Sudan so that they could not be seen to be supported by Khartoum, but that doesn't resolve the problem.
No, it doesn't.
And didn't in this.
If I can interrupt, I want to just get a quick word from Roland Marshall before I go back to Fuad Hikmat in Nairobi, because Abdul Wahid made the point there about France getting involved. Just very briefly, if you wouldn't mind, why isn't France more involved with the diplomatic efforts?
Well, I believe France actually is facing a very difficult problem. There are strong differences between the Minister of Foreign Affairs, who is very strongly, let us say, anti-Khartoum, to say it very roughly, and the Élysée Palace, who actually is taken a broader picture, one has a more nuanced approach towards Sudan, though at the same time is more adamant to endorse Idriss Deby. So we have a lot of unclear and contradictory statements, even for the French public. And certainly that means that France, for instance, right now has been putting pressure on Chad not to go into an international incident against Khartoum, but at the same time, you know, you freeze a conflict, you don't solve it, and this is certainly a situation, a stalemate France has been facing over the last 4 years at least, because they know very much what are the parameters of this conflict, but of course if they understand and take them, then they will have to question Idriss Deby, as well as they will have to refine a new policy towards Sudan and Darfur. It seems that our politicians right now are not willing to do so.
We're discussing the volatile situation in Chad and Sudan today. Our guests are Fuad Hikmat in Nairobi. Roland Marshall in Paris and Abdul Wahab Al Effendi in London. And, you know, gentlemen, while this conflict has continued, we shouldn't forget the International Criminal Court and that arrest warrant that it issued for the Sudanese President Omar al-Bashir. Now, the ICC, just to remind viewers, indicted Bashir on counts of crimes against humanity and war crimes committed since 2003 in Darfur. Right about the same time as the warrant was issued, tensions between Chad and Sudan escalated. Now, that could be sheer coincidence, or it could be a well-orchestrated move. Earlier this month, the Chadian President Idris Deby said his government would cooperate fully and openly with the ICC, probably no surprise there. Could give Chad the upper hand in this conflict with Sudan, perhaps a sense of higher credibility with the international community. Fuad Hikmat in Nairobi has been waiting there patiently. I'll come back to you at this point. The indictment of a sitting president for Sudan, in fact for any country, is a huge issue. It's a huge distraction, even though they might try to pass it off and say, well, we're not really worried about the ICC. Has Chad used that as an opportunity? Some analysts I've read are saying this has been very bold moves that Chad has taken for a so-called little brother. Has it really taken advantage of that Sudanese situation with Omar al-Bashir?
Well, actually, there is no doubt that the ICC indictment of al-Bashir is a major factor in the recent development. I don't rule that at all out. And it is a significant factor because the goodwill agreement which was signed between JEM and the government of Sudan, we knew that it was about renewing some confidence so that then the chief mediator could then kick off the framework for the peace talks in Darfur, in Doha. But very clearly that the indictment of al-Bashir had discouraged the environment for a genuine talks that it could reach to a final settlement in Darfur. And a lot of people today, they analyze that the recent incidents in Chad, and also with the Strait of Chad coming into Sudan, and with the rebel movement, JEM taking Kornoi, is a sort of heating up, the preheating of the political scene in Sudan, so that a final settlement could be reached where the NCP would provide concessions for a genuine settlement in Darfur. And within that, then people would look into a reasonable way of finding a solution for the ICC. But the ICC is definitely a factor. And I don't think Chad, in a way, is trying to capitalize on it fully, but definitely it is part of its calculation, because that it's the first time for Chad is to try to enter into the territory of its big brother so openly, and to say that they are going to do it again. And the response of the government of Sudan is totally different, that they said they preserved the right to attack their territory, but did not retaliate.
But then
and
surely,
very clearly that here,
Chad
thinks that Sudan is now on the weaker side.
But then surely, if Sudan has got so much international pressure and the international spotlight on Sudan over Omar al-Bashir and the ICC, over Darfur, over all sorts of reasons, surely they would want to be keeping their head down and keeping quiet and not inviting more criticism. I mean, they're talking about telling Chad forces that they'll be destroyed if they dare cross into the border. Surely they don't need that sort of talk at the moment.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the Sudanese government now is under pressure, very serious pressure, because internally the major ruling party of the government of national unity, which is the National Congress Party, is seeing that it is not providing a genuine concessions for solving Darfur. At the same time, the implementation of the comprehensive peace agreement is not going very well. Soon there will be the ruling of ABA from the International Tribunal in Hague on ABA, on the ABC. And very clearly that the partners, SPLM and the NCP, are pulling apart, and they are not working in partnership to pass the laws and all the necessary ingredients for the democratic transformation, which makes it in doubt the elections will happen in 2010. So very clearly that the NCP need to show positive steps and provide genuine concessions. And definitely part of that is not to disturb the situation in Chad. And of course, before the decision, maybe the NCP thought that to try to mitigate the support of Chad to GEM, so that in the Doha talks, GEM is not able to increase its influence in Darfur. But obviously this did not happen, because very clearly after the goodwill, but then the government made a decision to expel the international NGOs and not to expedite the exchange of the prisoners of war. Very clearly GEM took the opportunity to take a strategic town in Kornoi to give a very serious message. And they vowed also to move towards other big cities in Darfur. So very clearly that the situation in Sudan is very, very critical. And I see what happened between Sudan and Chad is part of that equation.
Abdul Wahab in London, let me bring you back into the conversation. We've focused a lot there on Sudan and its role in this conflict and the problems it's happening. What about Chad? Because there's of course two sides to every story. What does Chad need to do? Because it seems to be very belligerent and very brave, some might call it, in the action that it's taking, in the words that it's using.
Well, I think, let's put it in short words, Chad has an interest in this escalation of this conflict, because if it can show the world, or the international community currently is hostile to Khartoum. So if it can show that it is being threatened by Sudan, then it could count on its allies who are hostile to Sudan. By the same token, Sudan doesn't have an interest in seeing, as you said, in being seen to be hostile to Chad. But we have also been there before. I think the Chad, somebody said it was the first time Chad attacked Sudan. That was not the first time. In the 1980s, when Habri was in power, he also attacked the forces of Idris Deby inside Sudan, and he actually attacked the hospital where the wounded were being taken. So they are precedent to this, and we know how that ended. There was also a situation when Sudan has tension with Eritrea and Ethiopia, also over similar problems, and Uganda. And at that time, also Washington was on the side of those groups. So there was an interest on showing that Sudan was against you. But the international community then, as now, has also been sending mixing signals by supporting the peace process in the south, but at the same time indicting Khartoum. At the moment, I think the same is happening unless and until the international community start sending a constant message that they are for peace in Sudan, as they did after 2002 in the south. We are not going to have an end to this.
Roland Marshall, I've got a minute left. I'll leave the last word to you because I want to pick up on something you said a little bit earlier. You said you didn't think this was going to be a big flashpoint for Africa, or at least this part of Africa. Why is that? After everything we've discussed, Sudan, Chad, the internal problems in Darfur, why is this not the next flashpoint in Africa?
Because both France and Libya have absolutely no interest in a war between Chad and Sudan. And I believe to a certain extent both have been competing godfathers of regimes in Chad, and at the same time the international equation on Sudan would not allow a regime change under these kind of circumstances. So basically I believe there might be incidents, there might be against a war of statements, but I hope that dialogue will prevail. And I would just remember what just said Haile Menkayos, the Deputy General Secretary of the United Nations, saying that we are trying to build a peace process on Darfur. There should be as well a peace process in Chad by which the government and the armed opposition are under certain conditions discussing it and negotiating a settlement. So there is no way we could just believe that the military victory will reach a good result.
I'm going to have to jump in there and finish up the show, but thank you very much for all your thoughts today. Fuad Hikmat in Nairobi, Roland Marshall in Paris, and Abdul Wahab Al-Effendi in London. We'll keep a close eye on the situation in Chad and Sudan, of course. And thank you to our viewers for joining us here for Inside Story. Comments and suggestions, do email them to us, insidestory@aljazeera.net. From the whole team, it's goodbye for now.